All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Lincart, and welcome to the last installment for this semester of Research and Language Learning series. The format for today and throughout the many segments of this series, it's informal, and we have to really acknowledge why we even created this series. It's to facilitate conversations about language learning, but also how this language expertise competencies are used in scholarly works. And so today, I am so delighted to welcome Dr. Christina Kramer, a faculty member at the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, University of Toronto. Uh, like me and many others in the audience, Dr. Kramer does not need an introduction, but one of the most distinguished colleagues to join this series. And starting with something that I touched many, many years ago, her publications, let's say in 2003, I was walking in the stacks and I was looking at a lot of the language courses. And so one of them was Macedonian, a course for beginning and intermediate students. That was revised and expanded, third edition in 2011, as well as other articles, translations, and numerous articles in many journals. And so, what we would like to do is have Dr. Kramer give her remarks, which I think you would appreciate the title, A Stranger in a Strange Language, Macedonian in Me. So, go ahead, Professor Kramer.
I'm good. You have to let me share my screen.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
We took care of everything but that.
Yeah, just a second.
So
Eh,
while the screen sharing is going on, since I see that Victor Friedman is here, um, I'm going to dedicate this to him because I'm going to be speaking a lot about Victor Friedman today and all the different ways in which he influenced my career from the very beginning, even until now. And I'd also like to add a correction. I am a retired member of the faculty. This is an important distinction. I'm going to begin by just getting myself here. So I hope everyone looking at this screen, a stranger in a strange language, Macedonian and me, looks at this picture and says, why didn't I pick Macedonian? Largely, I'm going to be talking today without slides, but I will show a few slides and it should take about 20 minutes, unless a few extra minutes from my fiddling with the slides. But I just want to thank you for inviting me to share my experiences with Macedonian because I think I've had a very incredibly rich and varied career in Macedonian. I've actually had a very interesting career as a Slavist and a Balkanist, but Macedonian and Macedonia have been central to it. In preparing my paper, I keep trying to think of what younger scholars might be able to take from my experiences. I've listened to several of the talks that other teacher scholars have presented in this series, and there are some themes that reoccur. One of them is the strange serendipity that brought each of us to a less commonly taught language, and a kind of bewilderment at the opportunities this commitment to a new language gave us. There are others like me who sampled a range of languages before landing on the one. And there's others like me who didn't see themselves as the best language learner, but that there was something that clicked and made our careers in that language successful. Probably the question I have been asked most over the course of my career is, why Macedonian? How did that happen? So I've actually thought a lot about it, and I think the story goes like this. I began studying Spanish in grade 4, and I continued through grade 9. That year, a friend of one of my older brothers was studying Russian in high school. I was struggling with Spanish, and so in that inimitable teenage logic, I figured my study time was better spent learning the Cyrillic alphabet and a random set of Russian words rather than working on irregular Spanish verb conjugations. And indeed, it was a good decision because a year later I had dropped Spanish and I was enrolled in that very same high school Russian program. When I went to Beloit College, I intended to major in English with a focus on American 19th century literature, a love that continues. I'm reading Moby Dick for the fourth time right now. But instead, I ended up in a comparative literature class, a discipline I had never heard of. And I saw that I could combine here languages and literature, novels and poetry with Spanish and Russian. And I ended up with a triple major at Beloit, Russian language and literature, comparative literature with Russian and Spanish, and a self-designed major in modern languages, which was a precursor to what would become a linguistics major. Also at Beloit, I got swept up in the folk dance movement, popular on campuses in the 1970s. And I'm just going to share a picture because it turns out that folk dancing and Balkan folk music became the thin edge of the wedge that reignited my interest in the Balkans, which was something that had first been kindled in grade 9 when I read all the novels of Nikos Kazantzakis. Now, I am not in that picture on the left. I found it on the internet, but I know all the people in that line. So I am in that picture somewhere. I'm either behind the line or I'm behind the camera. But that's what folk dancing looked on the quad at Beloit College in 1971. The picture on the right shows how folk dancing has been a thread that's run through my career. That is me dancing last year at the Dumbeni Village banquet. Dumbeni is an Aegean Macedonian village. So that knowledge of folk dancing was something that allowed me to connect to communities across my whole career. Also at Beloit, I I learned some well, first I learned Bulgarian, Macedonian, and Croatian songs, and I got intrigued with these similarities and differences among Slavic languages. And at Beloit, I took, in addition to Russian, a year of the language formerly known as Serbo-Croatian, and an individualized reading course with a professor in reading Bulgarian, and a one semester introduction to modern Greek. Now, Beloit at that time required students to spend from 4 months to a year off campus working in something relating to their major. Now, at that time, of course, you couldn't just go off to the Soviet Union and get a job the way students later would go off to Russia for a year. Instead, I wrote a letter to City Hall in Woodburn, Oregon, to ask about work with the Old Believers. I had learned about them from a National Geographic article about the Old Believers in Alaska, which was published in September 1972. Someone in City Hall connected me with a Russian Orthodox family, and that family provided me a place to stay and helped connect me to work in a Old Believer daycare, the local library, and eventually to work on an Old Believer crew in the hop fields and the berry fields. By the time I went to the Soviet Union on the CIEE, the Center for International Education Exchange program to Leningrad in the summer of 1974, I had already had the experience of speaking Russian and non-standard Russian at that in everyday settings. It turns out I might not be the best language student, but I am persistent and creative. So I found ways to make even a little bit of language go a long way. So if I knew 10 words, I used 15. If I knew 15, I tried to invent an extra 6. Then I graduated Beloit into the recession of 1974. I worked as an office temp in Washington, D.C. for a year, but also did some freelance translations from Russian. Then I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to get a terminal MA in Russian literature while I figured out what my next move was going to be. There, I met a young professor, Victor Friedman, who noticed that I had been a folk dancer, which seems to have been the secret handshake of people becoming Balkanists at that time, and that I had already had an introduction to Bulgarian and some Greek and bits of other Slavic languages. So my first year, he offered a reading course a graduate reading course in Bulgarian and facilitated my application to attend the Letan Seminar, the summer seminar in Sofia, Bulgaria in 1977, and that reignited my linguistic interests. Victor then suggested the following summer I attend the Macedonian seminar as well. So in August 1978, I went to Macedonia something I had wanted to do since I began folk dancing, and then I really did never look back. For those of you, many of you listening to this probably already know this, but the summer intensive language programs, either in North America or going in country to those language programs, is really an excellent way to kickstart an interest in a new language. I came back, I switched from Russian literature to Slavic linguistics. I switched from a terminal MA with plans to continue on after the thesis to a PhD. I had found in Macedonia a place that brought together language, culture, music, and folklore. And without knowing it, I was becoming a Balkanist. I took courses with Victor Friedman in Albanian and Turkish, and while I never really became comfortable in either of those languages, I learned enough to use them in research and later to teach several students how to read Albanian. For my MA thesis, Friedman proposed that I translate an unpublished volume of erotic folk stories collected by Kirill Penushlisky. That is, translate several hundred pages of dialect texts and write a 100-page introduction. And indeed, in 1979, I defended my thesis on dialectisms and Turkisms in the unpublished erotic folk stories. Now, remember, there was, of course, no internet, and I had had limited formal study in Macedonian. And since the Macedonian standard language had only been codified only 30 years before, there was still no comprehensive Macedonian English dictionaries. So I had to make my way through the texts, translating them using an extremely inadequate Macedonian English dictionary, the 3-volume Macedonian Dictionary with Glasses in Serbo-Croatian, and then Benson's Serbo-Croatian English Dictionary. Many words, however, could only be found by working back through phonetic variation and historical sound changes using Božo Vidojevsky's dialect studies. So I want to show you a map of Macedonian dialects. So the dashed dotted line is the current border of the republic now known as the Republic of North Macedonia. But Macedonian dialects, of course, extend over a wider area. And these, while the West Central dialects are the standard language, the dialect texts of the Penushlisky stories covered the entire range of Macedonian dialect areas. This area down here, the Southwest, these particular Aegean dialects are going to become important later on in my career, so I just point them out now. It is probably safe to say that no one else ever learned Macedonian this way. And Victor has since written that he had actually vastly underestimated how difficult the texts were. They were all in different dialects and they were quite far from the standard. But once again, like my living with the old believers, early on in my language study, I was exposed to language variation, and I was forced to use creativity and determination to solve linguistic puzzles. Yeah. Prior to leaving on my combined Fulbright-IREX to Macedonia, I worked for almost a year at the Federal Research Division at the Library of Congress, reading and aggregating news from Albania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and from the Soviet Union. But I left the job to do doctoral work in Skopje in 1981-82. In Skopje, I conducted linguistic research that involved both data collection in the Institute for the Macedonian Language, but also field research, and I lived in the student dormitory surrounded by Macedonian and foreign students speaking Macedonian. So once again, I was exposed to lots of different ways of speaking Macedonian, different dialects, code switching, different stylistic registers, and non-native speakers who make errors in production. My dissertation on modality in Macedonian was a structural analysis of different modal particles and their contextually derived meanings. It was later published in 1986 as Analytic Modality in Macedonian, and I've shown you on the right what a distinctive featrix matrix looks like. Significantly, this data was collected from literature, field research, newspapers. It was built up from real language being used in context. In 1983, right after defending my thesis, I got a job at Murray State University in Western Kentucky. There I taught 5 semesters. I taught 5 semesters. I taught 3 years, 5 courses a term. I taught first, second, and third year Russian, a cultural introduction to linguistics, and first year Spanish. And Spanish was actually critical in my getting the job in the first place. In 1986, I was hired by the University of Toronto as a Slavic linguist to teach first and second year Russian and a series of graduate courses in synchronic Slavic linguistics. But a funny thing happened on the way. Toronto, it turns out, to have one of the largest diaspora Macedonian communities in the world. And shortly after I got to Toronto, the Macedonian community learned about me and they began funding a Macedonian language course through the Slavic department, which continued for almost 40 years. That is my entire academic career, opening up the possibility for me to have a career in Macedonian and phenomenal opportunities to study Macedonian and to continue my research. My students, particularly during my first 2 decades of teaching, were largely students from families who were among the Detsa Begaltsi, that is, the children refugees who were taken from that, largely from that southwest corner of the dialect area in the Aegean Macedonia, around the regions of Koster and Lerin. Prior to coming to Canada, I had known really virtually nothing about Aegean Macedonia and the dialect spoken there. Through the community, I learned a whole new aspect of Macedonian that I hadn't known before, and I got exposure to more language variation, language standardization, and a new appreciation for that deep sentimental affect of what speakers feel as nashi, the relationship between speakers to the particular variant spoken in their speech community. During the Yugoslav wars of separation in the 1990s, my research concerns really moved away from the study of modality. I wanted to explore more deeply the issues of language standardization, language and identity, language rights, and language and education. Like many of my colleagues in Slavic linguistics, including some who are on this call today, I developed what became, I think, one of my most important courses, Language, Politics, and Identity. My last semester of teaching in 2019, I had almost 50 students in that class, and among them they spoke 40 different languages. Except for the years when my children were very young, which coincided with the war years in Yugoslavia, I've gone to Macedonia at least once a year to conduct research, and I've continued throughout my career to publish articles on various aspects of Macedonian and Macedonian in a comparative Balkan context. Now, in the years when I was chair of the Slavic department, I would argue with the administration, tell me if you've heard this one, that class size as a sole indicator made no sense. Canada likely didn't need 50 students taking Estonian, but we needed some students learning Estonian. And as a top tier institution in Canada, we needed to assure that we were developing widely diverse talents because as a society, we don't know what skills we're going to need. When in the 1990s there was a need for Macedonian specialists, you couldn't just create one ex nihilo. I had already invested decades into acquiring the linguistic and cultural skills that were tapped at that time. My years of fieldwork and linguistic research developed into my Macedonian textbook. My Macedonian friend and colleague, Liljana Mitkovska, helped tremendously in the development of that grammar, and I'm going to show you Linguists at Work. Here we are at work on the Big Red Book. It has had 3 editions, as Joe mentioned. The first edition, the one in the upper left, was in fact rushed into print at the University of Wisconsin, and I won't tell you how many errors I've subsequently found, because there were government agencies like the Red Cross who were looking for teaching materials to use on the ground as war threatened Macedonia. I know subsequently that it was used by the U.S. Foreign Service and by U.S. Peace Corps volunteers, and I've heard from users of the textbook on 5 continents. While textbook writing has not historically been viewed as a major scholarly achievement, I view this book as probably my greatest contribution to scholarship and language pedagogy. The second edition, the one in the lower left-hand corner, was awarded the 2006 Atzeal Book Prize for Best Contribution to Language Pedagogy. For those who ever look at it, it was actually a thought experiment to see how I could combine grammar and translation with new modes of communicative grammar. I don't know how much I succeeded, but that was my intent. My knowledge of Macedonian has been tapped broadly. I served as an assessor to review Macedonian news broadcasts for Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. I've been an assessor for Title VIII grants, critical language programs, Penn International. I've provided and still provide proficiency exams for students at various universities who want the opportunity to use Macedonian to get their university language credit the way students in more popular languages get to do all the time. And in the midst of research, teaching, and service, translation came back into the picture. In 2004, I was invited to The Hague to help establish a Macedonian translation group for the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. I worked for 2 years with the ICTY, developing language tests. I assessed applicants. I developed a lexicon, and I did translation of victim statements. In 2011, Victor Friedman, Grace Fielder, Catherine Rudin, and I were able to realize our dream of translating the 19th century Bulgarian novel by Ganyu, which was nominated for various awards and won the Bulgarian Studies Association Book Prize. In 2014, my colleague at the University of Toronto, Dragana Obradovic, and I developed a made-up language, Lavinian, for the play by award-winning Canadian playwright Nicholas Billon for the play Butcher. Now, translating into a language which doesn't exist could not have happened without our knowledge of South Slavic languages, dialectology, historical Slavic linguistics, and significantly, the cultural milieu in which those languages are spoken. When I look back, I see that translation has always been there. I clearly like the moving between. I like moving between one language and another. I like to think about words, what they mean, how context changes them, how the etymology of words and the register in which they're used affect meaning and their translation into English. Linguistics and literature have always stood side by side in my work. While I have the linguistic ability to translate from other languages, I work almost exclusively with Macedonian because my life in Toronto and my frequent trips to Macedonia have kept the Macedonian language vibrantly alive, embedded in its varied and changing cultural contexts. I've since translated nearly a dozen novels, 10 of which are in print. There are 3 more in draft form looking for publishers. I'll get to show you my picture of them. But language changes. And here again, my linguistic training helps me every day. Every week, I read dozens and dozens of pages of Macedonian, and every day I'm faced with dozens of new words and syntactic variations that I'm encountering for the first time. You know, it's really funny the skills we pick up and we don't think about. I've been teaching language students, or I should say taught, I'm not doing it at the moment. I taught language students Russian, Spanish, and Macedonian for 4 decades. And all that homework was handwritten. I have read the handwriting of thousands of students writing in different languages. And guess what? What possible better training could there have been in the archives? So I'm going to just show you one example of a poem by Blaža Koneski that appears in the Macedonian grammar. I can totally read this handwriting. It feels very natural to me. The poem is commemoration. I want to see Kochoratsin, and they tell me, well, you know, he perished long ago on the mountain Lopushnik. Because I can go into the archives and I can read his handwriting, I can see the change in title. I can see in Reading that he opted for the objective form of Kochoratsina. And I can see how he added the name of Lopushnik by moving the quotation mark and penciling in something new. So the ability to read handwriting and to go and see the works of the authors that you're working on or that you're studying in my work on language standardization when I was working in the archives, that ability to read handwriting came in. Obviously, I couldn't have done the project without it. I'm currently finishing up my manuscript called Changing Viewpoints, Skopje Postcards, 1900 to 2019. And I wonder how I could have possibly read hundreds of postcards without that training in language variation, variation in styles of handwriting, linguistic errors, code switching, and other linguistic issues that came up without those 40 years of student homework. When I was a graduate student, during a dissertation meeting with Victor Friedman, he wrote on a little scrap of paper, more detail. I tucked it into a frame, and that scrap of paper was soon joined by a fortune from my fortune cookie that I got right at that time. It sat on my desk for over 40 years. And I think all the time about more detail and what that tells us, and that many possibilities are open, but we all just need to work a little harder to make those opportunities become a reality. I was once a stranger in a strange language. Macedonian was an odd choice, and it baffled many people, and I was told repeatedly that I would never get a job. Instead, Macedonian opened incredible doors for me that took me down pathways as varied as different kinds of research, different teaching, different service opportunities to different kinds of communities, both at the very local level and the international level, and of course, literary translation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kramer. Such a wonderful presentation. And now we're going to invite audience, you, to participate. The floor is open, so you could unmute and ask our speaker a question, and we're open for discussion. And we also have some questions that were submitted during the
Aha.
registration. And so I get to ask the first one. Possibly others are thinking about this. How and why have your research interests changed over the years? And
Mhm.
how has a serious level of language proficiency shaped that arc?
Well, I think I began by saying that I started in modality, and it was just a wonderful idea. Victor Friedman had written on the Macedonian indicative and the categories of the Macedonian indicative, but the non-indicative was work that still really needed to be explored. And even though I stopped doing that work, I know that my dissertation is still foundational for people working on different kinds of modality in Macedonian. And new theories, of course, have refined my work, and people have come up with really, I think, some very better solutions to some of the things I came up with. But I took the wars in Yugoslavia very hard. And I was teaching here in Toronto where the war was very much with us. We had students from families who wouldn't sit in the same classroom together. There were a number of years where my colleague Ralph Bogert offered a course called Language 100 and Language 102 because it would have students doing Serbian one day, Croatian another day, and then another day they'd be in the same classroom, but he didn't name it so that students wouldn't feel that it was a classroom they couldn't enter. So the war was very much here. And my Aegean students, my students from Aegean Macedonia, had also were going through the inherited trauma of their parents' um, experiences in the war and their inability to learn and become literate in Macedonian. Then when Macedonia became independent, there was all of the crises around the name, and the Greek lobby here in Toronto and abroad was sending hate mail and trying to get me fired from the university. So the reality of language as a lived experience, not to mention the Canadian context where um, Indigenous languages and the English-French tension is much more present, I think, than you might experience with English-Spanish on the everyday level in the US, that I just had to grapple with what language meant to these communities. And at that time, moving around the data, something that very few people were going to read, I felt a very pressing need to understand what was happening at that moment in the world. And at the same time, the constant attacks on the legitimacy of Macedonian drove my interest in language standardization and the history of partition. Because, of course, when I was going to Macedonia during the Yugoslav era, partition really wasn't talked about, and the Aegean Macedonian dialects weren't talked about. So all of a sudden, I'm in a community that has been profoundly influenced by language standardization and being outside the main currents of that standardization. Once again, I felt that I was in a unique position to use my research time and the milieu in which I was, and in the moment in which I was living as a linguist, to address issues that were really very pertinent, that I felt really needed to be addressed right then. And literary translation, it was just a gift. It's just been a gift that keeps on giving.
Thank you very much. Let's see if we have any questions or comments from our audience. Yes, Vladimir, please go ahead.
Добър ден, госпожа Крамер. Нямам някое прашение, ама сама сакам да ви благодаря много за вашата работа и с македонскиот јазик, и с македонската литература, и за да ga прави доступна за читатели и во целата Северна Америка.
Ви благодарам. Голема чест беше за мене да имам прилика да работам на ова граматика.
Голема чест да ви слышам тука.
Thank you very much. I have to say, as I look at the names here, that Ronel Alexander's wonderful Bulgarian grammar really sparked my courage to embark on it. And so really from the beginnings of my career to Brian Yang, with whom I've had the wonderful opportunity to work as a student mentor and then as colleagues, and to get to learn about his work, it's really been a remarkable career. Look, I can conjugate verbs now. I can stand here and do Spanish irregular verbs if you want. Like, I've got it. I'm ready to go.
I could say something. Just I can't resist. I have to how shall I put this? When Christina was talking about being a Balkan folk dancer as being a kind of secret handshake, I want to take that a step further. What happened, I actually remember the very moment. I was in charge of directing the teaching assistants for first-year Russian at UNC Chapel Hill, and I used to have meetings of those assistants. And one day I invited them over to my house for a meeting, and Christina saw my record collection, which was full of Balkan folk music, since I was a folk dancer myself in the old days. And she said to me, "Victor, I envy you your record collection." And it was those words that made me determine that, in fact, she should stop wasting her time on Russian literature and become a Balkanist instead. Just to...
Well, it's these funny generational things, like the generation of Ronel Alexander and Victor Friedman, Catherine Rudin. We all got to the Balkans through folk dancing.
Yeah.
And then to meet students who have learned Macedonian who don't know. Oh, wait a minute. It says that I may have switched to a different language. So I'm speaking English here, computer AI. I ako ova vi je problem, jaz ki preferlam i na makedonski, Juliu tam šum. Like, I don't know. AI is having a problem with whatever language I'm speaking. It became very strange to meet people who learned Macedonian to learn Macedonian, or disconnected from that folkloric tradition. It was a very, very strange generational shift for me.
Any other comments or questions?
Hold on, there's something sitting here in the chat. That's really lovely.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I know you're not here, but thank you.
That's
That's a
very
nice
sweet.
comment. Yeah.
Another beloiter, apparently. It was fun and very challenging to put the line to actually sit and think about how we got to our careers. And for a long time, I thought that folk dancing really was the Kickstarter. But I had this strange experience of thinking about it, and I realized that it actually goes back to Zorba the Greek and going and seeing that movie. And I'm from a big family, we all went to New York. We began eating Greek food. We had the record. I grew up listening to that record and all those lines. I fell in love with Nikos Kazantzakis. And as a 15-year-old, I read everything he wrote. I read all of his novels. I read his travelogues. I read his plays. I didn't read The Odyssey, a modern sequel. I read his autobiography. And hey, man, when you're 15 years old and you're reading about Nuri Bey and Captain Michalis in Megalocastro, it's so sexy. It's just like blows your head open. And I think that drove me to folk dancing. And then folk dancing drove me to the Balkans. It's kind of interesting, Ronnie, isn't it? When we just go back and think of origins.
Christina, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, thank you so much for all of that. And you probably recall the days with University of Wisconsin Press, and I had a lot of experience with them too, not just the Bulgarian grammar, but also the BCS 2-volume grammar. So a lot of this resonates. The
I'm sure.
the grammar, the 40 years, the fact of it now being over, being retired and looking back on it. So thank you. I don't know that I could do it as concisely and elegantly as you did, but thank you for the retrospective.
Thank you. It was, for me, the fact that Wisconsin, by the way, also did my first two translations came out. My first two Luan Starova novels came out with University of Wisconsin Press. I mean, it's
Very good. Yeah.
to be able to just have these opportunities because you've dedicated yourself to a language. And I'm going to see if I can, I'm going to indulge myself. I think I've lost you all for a moment. Are you all still there? I didn't close
Yeah,
my
we're all still
window.
here.
If you would indulge me for a moment, I would like to read you the dedication to the book that I'm finishing up. Because I think it also speaks to something about what it is as a linguist and a scholar, particularly living in this moment when we hear a lot about extractive practices. And I was thinking how all those years I'd go to Macedonia, and all those years, so many people helped me. And all those years, people sat and they went over my examples and they corrected my work and they corrected my errors when I was giving a presentation. And we think, how do we then give back to a community? Because these people are doing all this work for me, and I'm coming home and I'm earning a salary that they can only dream of. So, what is our relationship to the communities that we're working with? And I hoped with the grammar and teaching Macedonian here to this community that I was somehow doing payback to that community. And I also hope through the dedication to my postcard book, which is this book is dedicated to the city of Skopje, to the people who live and have lived there, and to all those who have shared their languages, literature, music, and history with me over the past half century.
Nice.
So I think, and when I look at these other talks that other people have given, that it's not just a language, that we become, we have an opportunity to meet people, to meet, one, to meet people where they live, and the other to meet people that we would never have been able to speak with, but the language opens the door. And we don't know who's on the other side of the door. So when I stood on top of Mount Vitosha speaking Bulgarian to a Chinese woman, and that was our common language, or hanging out with all the students from Africa in the dormitory, and our common language was Macedonian, it's opening doors that we can't predict when we start out.
Right.
So yeah, I just been, I really thank Victor for opening up that door and continue to opening doors for me. It's a wonderful collegial and mentor relationship, and that's the other part of our graduate work, that we don't always have the opportunity to say these things.
Okay. Right. We have a question that was submitted, but we're inviting our colleague to ask that question. Rojisa, please.
Ružica, you're
Rojisa,
there.
yeah. Yep, there you go. You're
Can
muted
you
currently. Yeah.
hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry. I thought my question will be read, but never mind. Maybe I should ask this question in Macedonian if Dr. Kramer is okay with that.
Važi, ajde.
Прво и основно многу ми е мило вака кога ве слушам како зборувате, бидејќи немате некој акцент што го препознавам кај луѓе од страна, значи не македонци кога зборат македонски, туку звучите баш македонски, ако ме
О,
разберете.
благодарам.
Ева вака
Сполајти, ова ми е голема чест.
Прашањето мое е, значи јас сум фолклорист и баш сега работам на македонската традиционална храна, поточно ајварот. И имам,
О, јас сум готова за прашањето.
да, инаку доста имам, ова ми е докторска дисертација, така што имам интервју правено со наши во Македонија, со наши тука и во Канада, и баш сега во моментов работам на чептерот за македонците во Канада и како нели македонците со ајварот се поврзуваат, како се идентификуваат, што значи ајварот нели за нашите тука. И еден од најголемите предизвици за мене, барем нели како македонки, како интелектуалка е како јас да ги пренесам тие нели оригинални цитати, оригинални изјави од нашите на англиски јазик и дали тоа ќе биде нели преведено, да речеме, автентично. Па моето прашање беше некако патено кон вас, дали вие сте се соочиле со такви слични може предизвици, нели сепак како немакедонски говорител, да пробате да преведете нешто на англиски и дали тоа нели сепак ќе биде преведено на начин на кој прво македонците го разбираат, после вие и нели тие трети читатели или слушатели.
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure. I'm going to move this to English so that those here who don't speak Macedonian, I'm not sure I understand what the question exactly, but Ružica asked on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. She's a folklorist and she's working on in doing interviews with people about the importance of the making of Ivar to Macedonians in Macedonia and in the diaspora. For those of you who have not had whose lives have been impoverished because you have not eaten Macedonian Ivar, you might have bought Ivar in a store near you, but if it's not Macedonian Ivar, it may not have been roasted. Some people steam the peppers, but the peppers need to be roasted. I think I make some of the very best Macedonian Ivar. My husband and I have been making Ivar for 30 years in our backyard here. And so I think the question is how these traditions, and correct me if I'm not quite, if I haven't pulled the kernel out, how these traditions get translated into English and how they're understood in a non-Macedonian community, and whether there are things like this that get interpreted that are related to traditional practices and how they're interpreted in the other community. Dali są blisko do praszania.
Yes, basically that, yeah. What I was trying to say is that, once you take a citation by someone, right, a quote by an informant, a participant in your study, and I as a Macedonian understand that completely, right, because I speak the language.
Right.
But the difficulty I face is when I try to translate this, and I always have this sense of loss, that I'm missing something. I'm not telling the whole story, that the sentence, the quote is not translated in a proper way. And I'm afraid that people won't understand that. As one of my participants said, you have to taste Ivor to understand us, right?
Okay, so this is great. This is a translation question.
Yeah.
So how often do we hear it's untranslatable? It's not translatable. Look, everything is translatable. Is it going to capture everything? No. Is it going to be the exact same thing? No. If somebody else goes to the store and buys this exact same blouse and we're both wearing it, they don't look the same. So there are things that don't translate, but we live in a world of translation. There is no civilization without translation. So we're always translating, and we're always translating within a language where my students think the word soba is an oven, and in my textbook they're going into the soba, and my students can't figure out why they're going into the oven. So we're always negotiating. And you may have never tasted a Nanaimo bar. You may not know what a Nanaimo bar is, but if I tell you a Nanaimo bar is a multi-layered cake cookie that they make here in Canada, and it's got a vanilla layer and a chocolate layer, and it's got a wafer level layer, and it is super sweet, and it's named for Nanaimo, British Columbia, so it also has this sort of local pride. You can't taste it, but you're getting a culturally situated meaning of a particular food. So Ivar, even if you taste it out of the jar, if you haven't walked through the streets of Skopje and seen everybody carrying the net bags and smelled the air filled with the smell of the roasting peppers and read the newspaper about the latest attempt to arrest people for polluting the air in Skopje with Ivar smoke instead of burning tires, look, people can't experience everything, but that work with native speakers can bridge the gap and make people engaged in what Ivar means to the communities making it. So I think we diminish ourselves if we just keep reverting to the trope that it's not translatable. Because that's how we live. We live in translation. We can't live everybody else's life, but we can be understanding and empathetic and vicariously enjoy the experiences of these foods that we can't get access to. So I don't know if that answers the question or whether you agree with me or whether others agree or disagree, but I think it's a wonderful question. And I just happen to have strong feelings about the answer.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I'm just shocked that you're making Ivor, and feeling so sorry I didn't discover you earlier.
Well, let me tell you, Victor, how's my Ivar?
Wait a minute. There we go. Your Ivar is so good that when you bring it to us in freezer packages, I hide it and do not share it with anybody except my husband.
And there we are.
Also, we are capable of eating an entire Ziploc bag full in a sitting.
Christina, we have another question from one of our participants, Sonia. Thank you very much for that question. So the question goes, when you reflect on the beginnings of your career as a balkanist, what advice would you give yourself now if you could talk to your younger self?
I wasted so much time and so much energy and psychological energy in worrying that I'd never succeed. I worried so much that I wouldn't get a job. I didn't see anyone else around me get a job. I was racked with anxiety. I was lucky I did get the jobs I got. I was very lucky in my career. But all through my career, there were exit ramps to do other interesting things. And if it hadn't been the academic door, it could have been a different door. That I had opportunities. I could have stayed on at the Federal Research Division, for example, and had an incredible career with these languages. I was tapped to do other things and to step out into the nonprofit world, um, working with students at different levels, translating. So I think I would tell my younger self, even if my younger self were now, where the job landscape is even worse, look, chill out. You're going to have a life. And you're going to have a life whether you're going to get to use these languages every day. Your life is going to have been deeply and profoundly changed because of the time you spent in these countries, the work you did with these people, your understanding of yourself, the world, literature, language, education, identity. All my ways of being in the world are because I had those opportunities when I was young. And I wasted a lot of that time by lying in bed and kvetching to my advisor that I was never going to get a job and my life was going to be ruined. So I wish and what I'm asking my younger self and other young people is to have a belief and a hope that they will find interesting work and that they will find a way to be in the world where they can be empathetic to other people and where they can help other people with the knowledge they have, and they can provide succor and places of refuge for others because we have been strangers in a strange land ourselves.
Thank you very
Just
much for
saying.
that. Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
May I just say, Ružica, javi mi se, ako imate, javete mi se, ako imate drugi prašanja. Sekogaš će mi bude drago da slušam od vas.
Baži nema problem, ki vi pišem.
All right. Well, in that case, we should really thank Christina for this wonderful presentation and sharing insights about her journey, as well as your questions as well. We need to thank you for that. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating in today's conversation. And we would like to thank our partnering institutions, Indiana University's Language Workshop, American Councils, and Arizona State University's Milyakin Center, as well as here, our center here, Russian East European Eurasian Studies Center, and all my colleagues at the Slavic Reference Service for working to make this series such a good place for conversation. So thank you again, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much. And it was a real honor to be able to be part of it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Take care. Bye. There we go.